I want to read a portion of Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist?, where he's trying to refute mythicism, but in actuality he demonstrates how mythicism is the most likely conclusion. I'm in chapter 1 of his book, on page 30, where he's describing the mythicist position. He says, mythicists typically stress that there are no reliable references to the existence of Jesus in any non-Christian sources of the first century. Jesus allegedly lived until about the year 30, but no Greek or Roman author, or any other non-Christian author for that matter, mentions him for over 80 years after that. If Jesus was such an important figure, or even if he wasn't so important, wouldn't there be a reference to him in some of our many surviving sources from the first century? We have the writings of historians, politicians, philosophers, religion scholars, poets, and scientists. We have inscriptions placed on buildings and personal letters written by average people. In none of these non-Christian writings of the first century is Jesus ever mentioned, not even once. Bart is not refuting that. That is the statement of the evidence. Keep reading. It is typically argued by those who hold to Jesus' historical existence that he is in fact mentioned by one author, the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote a number of surviving books near the end of the first century. Mythicists, however, claim that the two references to Jesus in Josephus's book, Jewish Antiquities, these are the only two mentions of Jesus in all of Josephus's abundant writings. But the mythicists claim that they were not written originally by Josephus, but were inserted into his writings by later Christian scribes. If they are right, this would mean that we don't have a single reference to Jesus in non-Christian text before the writings of Pliny, a Roman governor of the province in what is now Turkey in 112 CE, and in the writings of Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius a few years later. Some mythicists claim that these references too were inserted into these writings, that they are not original. We will be looking at all of these references soon. For now, it is enough to note that mythicists argue that it is hard to believe that Jesus would not be talked about, argued with, commented on, or even mentioned by writers of his own day or in the decades afterward if he really existed. In addition, they typically claim that the historical Jesus does not appear prominently even in early Christian writings apart from the New Testament Gospels. In particular, they maintain that the Apostle Paul says hardly anything about the historical Jesus, or that he says nothing at all. This may come as a shock to most readers of the New Testament, but a careful reading of Paul's letters shows the problems. Paul has a lot to say about Jesus' death and resurrection, especially the resurrection, and he clearly worships him as his Lord. But he says very little indeed about anything that Jesus said and did while he was alive. Why would that be, if Jesus was in fact a historical person? Why doesn't Paul quote the words of Jesus, such as the Sermon on the Mount? Why does he never refer to any of Jesus' parables? Why doesn't he indicate what Jesus did? Why not mention any of his miracles, his exorcisms, his controversies, his trip to Jerusalem, his trial before Pontius Pilate, and on and on? Here again, the defenders of Jesus' historicity point out that Paul on several occasions does appear to quote Jesus, like in 1 Corinthians 11:22 about the Lord's Supper. Some mythicists argue that these quotations, like those of Josephus, were not originally in the writings of Paul, but were inserted by later scribes. Other mythicists argue that Paul is not quoting the words of the historical Jesus, but is quoting the words the heavenly Jesus has spoken through Christian prophets in Paul's communities. For both kinds of mythicists, Paul did not know or think about the historical person of Jesus. For him, Jesus was a heavenly being of mythical proportions. How, you might wonder, could a non-historical person die? Mythicists have an explanation for that too, as we will see. For now, it is enough to know that they generally insist that Paul did not refer to the historical Jesus, and they point out that this would be very strange if in fact he knew that he existed. The same can be said of the other writings of the New Testament outside the Gospels. This means that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are our only real sources for knowing about the historical Jesus. And mythicists find these four sources highly problematic as historical documents. For one thing, they were written near the end of the first century at best. And this is my commentary. We don't know that they were written at the end of the first century, but that's the best you can possibly say, is that they were written at the end of the first century. I think they were written later. Bart says at least 4 or 5 decades or more after Jesus allegedly lived. If he really did live, wouldn't we have some earlier sources? And how can we rely on such hearsay from so many years later? Moreover, mythicists typically point out that the Gospels cannot be trusted in what they do say. There are many accounts of what Jesus said and did are chock full of contradictions and discrepancies, and so are completely unreliable. The Gospels are thoroughly biased toward their subject matter, and so do not present anything like disinterested history as it really was. They can be shown to have modified the stories they relate, and in some places they obviously have made up stories about Jesus. In fact, virtually all, or even all, of the stories may have been invented. This is Bart saying in agreement that it's possible that every single story of Jesus was completely invented. Back to Bart. This is especially the case with the so-called miracles of Jesus, narrated by the gospel writers to convince others to believe in him, but incredible to the point that, well, they are literally incredible or not to be believed. They are not credible. That is Bart Ehrman's words. The Gospels are not credible. Furthermore, many mythicists insist that the four Gospels ultimately all go back to just one of the Gospels, Mark, on which the other three are based. This means that of all the many writers, pagan, Jewish, and Christian, that we have from the first century, assuming Mark was written as early as the first century, and that's a big assumption, we have only one that describes or even mentions the life of the historical Jesus. How plausible is that, if Jesus actually lived? So Bart is even aware that there is a very good argument that there is only one first century writing about the life of the historical Jesus, and it would be the Gospel of Mark. But he says we're not even sure that that came from the first century. Back to Bart. Given all these problems, some mythicists insist that the burden of proof rests on anyone who wants to claim that Jesus did in fact exist. When I found out the truth about the evidence of Jesus and how weak it really is, I concluded that it's far more likely that Jesus didn't even exist and that all the stories are simply made up. And Bart Ehrman has just proven to you that he also recognizes that the evidence for Jesus is extremely weak. But he still draws the conclusion that Jesus was a real person, but that all the stories that were written about him were fictional tales, which to me is a dishonest conclusion. If you discredit the sources for Jesus and recognize that the sources are extremely weak and incredible or not credible, then it's irrational to conclude that Jesus was a real person when every single source for him is known to be incredible. But even if Bart is correct, the Jesus that Bart believes existed is not the Christian Jesus who performed miracles. Bart is an atheist. Bart left Christianity because he realized that Christianity is a false religion built on lies.